Joining us live now is Fuad Kavur, British opera and film director and producer. We've watched a film unfold today, haven't we, Fuad? What do you think about the situation in Turkey at the moment?
Well, unfortunately, it is obviously extremely undesirable and very, very dangerous, because it has a potential of turning into some sort of civil war. However, I think it's obvious that in a democracy, a military intervention is not the most desirable way of expressing one's ideas. Having said that, I have to also underline the fact that it has happened, and it doesn't advertise the stability of the country or the happiness of the country. If these things happen, they are symptomatic of some sort of unease, unhappiness. I mean, only 3 years ago, there was a huge big protest, as you may remember, in July 2013 in Istanbul Gezi Park. And again, Erdogan crushed this most brutally, killing about 9 or 10 people, including a 12-year-old boy, whom he later called a terrorist. So, you know, there are two sides of the story. And the fact that we are where we are tonight is, to some degree, Erdogan's own doing. That's what I think.
It is a very interesting situation how everything's developed over the course of just a few hours, because initially it looked like the military were very much in control, but what we've seen on the streets are people supporting Erdogan. A couple of the experts that we've spoken to have said they're not necessarily supporting Erdogan, they just don't want the military to take over the country. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I remember during Gezi Park protests in 2013, Erdogan said, for every 1,000 people that you produce on the square in Gezi Park, I could produce 1 million against you. So he has this sort of power. I don't know, I mean, I feel that this is also not the most democratic way for a president to call on his supporters to say, get out into the street and confront the army, because it is a little bit like Hitler saying to his brown shirts, get out and show them what you can do, you know? This is not a way to run a country, not at all.
We just got to be a bit dangerous, a bit careful,
I feel
Fuad.
that obviously...
Fuad, we'll just be a bit careful in the comparisons that we make, but carry on.
Yes, I know these comparisons are never pleasing, but if I could make another comparison about what's happening in Turkey, it is to some degree very, very similar to what we have lived in the last few weeks in England. Like we have British politics in the last 30 years or so ripped right in the middle between Europe and Euroskeptics. Now, in Turkey, we have a very similar situation since 1923, which is the ideas of Kemal Atatürk and what Kemal Atatürk wanted to make of the Turk, what kind of a human being a Turk would be, and what kind of a society it would be, which was basically a liberal, modern Western society. And what has ripped the Turkish politics since the death of Kemal Atatürk, 1938, was the religious revival, because unfortunately certain politicians have discovered that as soon as they play the religious card, they get elected. And you know, there's been many politicians who said, well, you know, in the last 4 years we have built 500 mosques instead of saying we have built 500 schools or hospitals. And this has been the tragedy of the Turkish society, and in particular, I mean, of that ilk, Mr. Erdogan has been the worst kind, because in my opinion, and a lot of people I believe share this, because don't forget that Turkish politics also is divided 50-50. I mean, Mr. Erdogan came to power only with just over 50% of the electorate's vote. You know, the idea of making an Islamic society out of Turkey, rowing backwards towards a non-secular country, and this deep hatred of Kemal Atatürk. I mean, I will give you one example which is absolutely true. In Taksim Square, we have a huge big opera house which is very similar in structure to the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And it's called the Atatürk Cultural Center. And it has been closed something like 5 years with the excuse that, you know, they're renovating it. And not even a nail has been put on it to renovate it. And he has this drive to close down and destroy everything which carries the name Atatürk. Like we have a big airport in Istanbul. Now he is building another one at the other end, which is going to be, I believe, the biggest airport in the world or something. And I don't think it's a brainer for us to guess what the airport is going to be called. So this drive to take the country away from Atatürk's reforms and drive it to a very, very non-secular religious Islamic republic, 50% of the country are not happy with it. And this is why these things are happening. I mean, in 1968, I remember, in France, when I was at the French school in London, people came out in barricades because they were unhappy about Charles de Gaulle. You know, people don't do these things because they're happy with their leaders. I mean, 3 years ago, Gezi Park was a very, very serious demonstration. This is another one. And I think Mr. Erdogan, instead of saying, you know, these people will pay a huge, big, heavy price, etc., I think he should probably, as they say in the theater, you know, leave your audience before the audience leaves you. He should maybe think of his retirement. That's what I think.
So we're just getting the latest reports that CNN Turk is back on air again, and the head of the channel is currently explaining what happened. Also, well, we already know that Mr. Erdogan himself is back in Istanbul, and he's already given a press conference saying that he will not leave as this military coup was attempted. And we're also hearing from the Turkish Prime Minister, who says that more than 120 people have been arrested over this coup attempt. Would you say we may be seeing this coup being turned around and the control is back in the hands of Mr. Erdogan?
Ne yaparlarsa yapsınlar, Türkiye eski Türkiye değil.
Well, you know,
Yeni Türkiye'nin davranış
I have
çok daha farklı.
I have worked some part of my life in opera, another part in movies. I'm not an expert in, you know, coup d'etats. I'm not a military strategist. But again, if Mr. Erdogan is back, he ought to learn the lessons, because tonight, as I was watching television, I had about 400 emails from various friends all over the world. I hate to say this, but they were celebrating this event. and saying, you know, finally we're going to get rid of him. And if, you know, 50% of the electorate means that you haven't got the other 50%, and they happen to be more educated people of Turkey, more Kemalists, more people that Atatürk created.
Fuad, thanks very much.
He may have
Fuad,
won
can you hear me?
the battle tonight,
It's
but
been
it
an
is not,
absolute
it's
pleasure,
not the end of
Fuad,
it.
to talk to you.
Yeah, thank
Real
you.
pleasure. Fuad Kavur, British opera and
Thank
film
you.
director and
Thank you.
producer. Thanks for your insight.